Today, we are once again talking about the subject of hunting and conservation, or more specifically, conservation through hunting. And also, the reason we have this episode is that I have a book for you. The book is titled Bringing Back the Wild, Stories from Revitalized Ecosystems Around the World and How Sport Hunting Supports Them. And oh my God, the book is like just excellent hunting and conservation read. And it is taking you, the reader, around the world. Exotic locations, Mozambique, Cameroon, Namibia, Mexico, but also less exotic like the UK and Sweden, and obviously some locations in Canada and the US. And our guest today is the author, of course, Mike Arnold. Mike is a lifelong hunter, published hundreds of articles in the outdoors and field sports magazines. But he also published hundreds of research papers, as Mike is a distinguished research professor and head of the Department of Genetics at the University of Georgia. Mike, welcome to the show.
Tommy, thank you so much for having me on. I hope my accent doesn't kill all of your readers and listeners.
No, I like your accent. No, actually, now when you said it, I only paid attention to your accent, and it's if my accent doesn't put them off, then yours is perfectly fine. Yours is perfectly fine. Mike, I gotta start with you have a lot of scientific credentials. Department of Genetics. So I'm wondering, how your love for the outdoors and hunting goes, whether it goes hand in hand with your passion for science or whether it created some sort of a healthy friction between the two. So I'm just curious, like how do how these two disciplines match or don't in your life?
Really, they've always dovetailed together very well. Before I was a scientist, I've always been one of those nerd, geeky people who love to be out in the woods. Still remember carrying around what we call in the U.S. plaster of Paris. So you mix it together and I used to pour it in tracks that I would find in the woods while I lived in the country. This is how nerdy I was, okay? And I would let it set, it sort of gets hard fairly quickly, and I would pull it up, and then I would take it back home, and I had all these biology books, simple ones, but biology books, and I'd leaf through them trying to figure out what in the world that had made that track. So I've always been interested in nature. Never really wanted to sit behind a desk or at a lab bench as much, although I'd done a lot of that during my career. But the genetics came in hand in hand with conservation biology, because as a conservation geneticist or genomicist, they call us now. It's a highfalutin term for we do the same thing. But we look at the genes and we try to figure out how many animals used to be there, if they're rare now, or if they're even very common. And we try to figure out how that affected how they develop through time and what we can do to protect them by knowing whether or not, they're too closely related. I've been working on rhinos quite a bit in Africa, and that's a problem there. When you have properties, and you say, okay, we have a lot of males and females here. Are they related? Because if they are, we want to move some of those out and move some males and females from another property in. They're not related. You don't want inbreeding. So all these things have gone together. And then the hunting part, I started hunting, oh my goodness, when I was 5, maybe. I took my first white-tailed deer actually when I was 5, but probably a little bit before that. And it was all mixed up with this idea of loving nature, loving being out there, loving seeing all the natural work, but also the passion of sport hunting, of going after and trying to understand sort of what animals were thinking so that you could harvest them. So all of that's all mixed together somehow in there and has worked out really well for me.
This is your second book. And I am curious of two things. One, the motivation. I kind of can understand the motivation behind writing this book, but I would like to hear from you. But what interests me more is how long it took to write this book, like to all these travel, like all these things. So like if you had to quantify, have you already had this experience? Have you traveled specifically for the book, or was there any travels that were for the book, or this is just like you were doing that anyway and you decided just compile it all in the form of this book?
Well, the first thing is that to let you know, I wrote 4 books before these 2.
Oh, okay.
And those 4 books, no, you wouldn't have known, because those 4 books were specialist science books for Oxford University Press, my 4 previous books. So now I've done 6. I'm working on the 7th right now, but all 6 of those, from the time that I sat down at my laptop to the time that that I turned it in to the publishers, was about 9 months. So the writing took about 9 months. The research for that would have taken, for all of those books, each one of those books would have taken another 6 months or a year. These last 2 that we're talking about, which are I always kid, they're readable for most normal human beings. The other 4 are not. They are specialist scientific books that I'm very proud of, but I wouldn't wish them on somebody unless they were lacking sleep, unless they were in that field. So the last 2 took, like, as you've alluded to, took travel. So this last one took me a good year of travel to collect material to finish out a bunch of chapters in that book, because you mentioned all the places that are discussed in the book that I write about stretch from Mexico to, like you said, Sweden to Africa to British Columbia, all over the place. So it took time to actually go to those places, do the interviews with conservation biologists who were there, who were in the hunting industry, and also to do a little bit of hunting while I was there to experience how that was working there. So it took a while. So I would say a good 2 years from the time that I start thinking about it to the time the book comes out, which is if I finish one and start the next one, a 2-year interval is what publishers will tell you is a good amount of space between your books.
No, and now with the 6 books, you have already the process of writing books nailed down. So it's like you already know what you're doing.
Well, it's insanity is what they, I'm pretty sure there's an insanity aspect to this. Churchill, one famously said that it starts out as a mistress and ends up as a monster, and you're just wanting to kill it and throw it into public, to get it away from you.
I don't remember that quote, but that sounds like Churchill, all right. Before we jump into the a more serious stuff, I gotta ask you this one question. Tell me about the red buffalo hunt, because the photo is like this animal of your dream. So that was just a West African Savannah buffalo, but was it like a special coloration, red colored, or they all red colored?
So yeah, that one was a bucket list animal for me. So what they have color phases there. Mammals have color phases quite often. So you have, over here in North America, you have quote unquote black bears, but they can be every color in certain areas from blonde all the way through to coal black, just completely black. I got one recently called cinnamon, which I colored, I call it chocolate, but colored. But anyway, so mammals, you can tell I'm geeking out on you again. Mammals have these color phases. And I've worked on mammals quite a bit of my life. And so I was fascinated by the fact that I had seen photos in other books about these West African Savannah buffaloes over there that did have these color phases. You get black and you get this reddish ochre colored animal, and you have some intergrades in between those, of course. And they're in the same herds. They're not a different species. They're just a color phase. And so I went in and I told them, and of course, I published an article in Sportsfield about this, and I called it "A Buffalo as Red as My Hair," and it actually is redder than my hair. And I wanted that color phase if we possibly could get it, and they had plenty, and so we could. Now, the thing about it is, there was a size difference too. The black buffaloes that I saw there, the bulls, some of the bulls anyway, were much taller, much larger than the red bulls. I don't know if that is a biological reality, i.e. that if you went into all areas, it's always going to be that way. I don't know, but I didn't care. I knew the horns were actually, that red buffalo's right there on my wall. I didn't really care. I just wanted the experience of hunting these animals in their habitat, and also I wanted that color phase if it was possible. It's not McDonald's. You can't go and shop, and it's hunting. They're not in a pen. And so it could have turned out that I got a black buffalo, and I would have been perfectly happy with that. It's a wonderful
But you passed
adventure.
up on the black one.
I did pass up the black ones, and my PH, Hervé, was nice. He didn't shoot me for passing up larger animals, which was quite kind of him. You know, some PHs might have beaten me around the head and neck with my own rifle. But yes, we did. We did pass up black. He felt that we could get a red. We had plenty of days, and we ended up getting a beautiful buffalo.
And they are different species than Cape buffalo, or can they interbreed?
Yeah, they can interbreed. So there's, once again, geeking out on you, the biology is that if you start in Southern Africa, for those listeners and who have done this will already know this, but if you start in Southern Africa back before Europeans really came in there and started decimating the herds of buffaloes, you had Cape buffaloes, really the largest form, the one with the really pronounced bosses, etc. And if you go straight up the East Coast, but inside just a little bit through Zambia, Zimbabwe, whatever, and you curve through central, it's still sub-Saharan, obviously, Africa, and go west through central and go all the way over to the west, you'll end up with the larger form transitioning into the smaller form. It's actually associated once again with a biological rule. It's called Bergmann's rule, and it's the closer you get to the equator, the smaller mammals get. The further away you get from the equator, the larger. I'm talking about the same group. So they fit that. So if you, in the U.S., in North America, if you go from North America and South America, you go from South America all the way up into Canada, the white-tailed deer are much smaller in South America than they are in North. And it has to do with, I'll shush in a second, it has to do with the body size aiding in temperature control. And that's what it has to do.
I was gonna say that is probably related to the temperature.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. It's thermal regulation. So, but anyway, so the Cape buffalo's large in the south. You get up into the northern part of that distribution, they get smaller. The buffaloes get smaller.
Okay. Thank you. That satisfied my curiosity about the red buffalo. In one of the chapters, you're like, I think it's the first chapter or one of the first after introduction, you're taking part in the rhino darting, and we spoke about rhino situation in the podcast already twice. How does it look like now, right now? Is it all going south as it used to, or is it like if there's any hope?
It is not going south, actually. It is. The situation is always going to be fragile with endangered species or species that are threatened. But the fact of the matter is the rhinos situation, especially, well, even for black rhinos, are improving by orders of magnitude because of hunting. Okay, and let me explain what I mean by that. So let's contrast Kruger National Park in South Africa and versus the property that you're referring to that I wrote about, Kalahari Oryx in the Kalahari Desert, which is a private property, and it is funded by hunting. So in Kruger National Park, over the last 10-ish years, they've lost over 90% of their rhinos. That's in Kruger National Park. They have been poached clean, basically, of rhinos. In that same, well, even longer, but let's say in the last decade, Kalahari Oryx has lost no rhinos because they can afford the protection for anti-poaching through the hunting. And so all of their black rhinos have been protected. All the white rhinos have been protected. They've increased. They've been able to disperse their rhinos, move them, transport them to even to Namibia and places like that, to other properties that can also protect them. But there is hunting associated with them to fund that work. So if we look at Kruger or at any national parks, honestly, any national parks anywhere where they're not that well funded, I know there's, millions of people that visit Kruger. You would think they would have the money, but it's a tough thing to do to protect those animals against the poaching bands that are poaching mafia that are sent in, those gangs into those areas. Is really tough for the government to protect them. Private property can protect them, but they can only do so, and this is the fragile nature of it, they can only do so if the government gives them permits to harvest mature males. They don't bring rhinos in to shoot. They bring rhinos in to actually have a population that then they end up with mature males that are past breeding age, in however many years, and then they can harvest those. So that's how the rhinos are actually doing well, but not in the places like national parks. They're not doing well there at all. If they're not protected, they're killed. That's the bottom line. They're harvested by poachers.
Yeah, that's a kind of sad state of affairs. But it's good to hear that there's some hope through these reserves.
There is. The major thing, and this is of interest, I think, well, it's definitely of interest to me. They bring me in because they're taking DNA samples and things like that, and we're working with their herds, and they're trying to figure out what their herd constitution is genetically. The nice thing about it is there are many people that are working together in a network who are moving rhinos around so that genetic enrichment is possible, so that they keep the animals' populations genetically as diverse as possible. I mentioned this before, and so they're spending the money. I mean, the landowners are spending millions and millions of dollars a year on these because they feel like it's a legacy. They're putting their own money into, they have skin in the game, as we say.
Let's switch the gear now a little bit and talk about conservation and how hunting, dovetails or supports conservation. And I would like to start with your vast experience in other parts of the world, and I would like to ask you about the part of the world that I'm familiar with, which is the UK. I often say that I am as pro-hunting as they get, but I'm often not happy with the hunters or hunting organizations. And one of the things that irritates me to a degree is where hunters go like, oh, hunting is conservation, hunter is a conservationist, right? And I say, well, maybe not. So for example, in the United States, you have a lovely Pittman-Robertson Act, Dingell Johnson, and hunters kind of can claim that they're conservationists, not because they are conservationists, but because they are part of the wider system that is using hunters as contributing to the conservation mechanism. So I'm part of the system and therefore I'm a conservationist. Okay, we can have that discussion. Now, in the different parts of the world, that looks differently. And I would like you to hear your views, positive and critical and whatever, the whole deal, comparing what you found in the UK and the hunting in the UK versus hunting in the United States.
So here's what I would say, and I would probably, well, we can just anchor in the UK. So if we look at let's just take one species. Let's take the muntjac for a moment. Okay, because in the UK, a lot of your hunting is going, as you know better than me, a lot of your hunting is for what we call exotic species here. So introduced species. The muntjac, the Chinese water deer, the sika, fill in the blank. I mean, there's a lot of them there. So there's the way the hunters in the UK, and I'd love to talk about game meat in a little bit, but let's just talk about conservation for a moment. And we're not talking about, what I want to do is not just say, oh, well, we're talking about conservation of sika or muntjacs or Chinese water deer or red deer or whatever. No, what we want to do as hunters is to broaden that and say, is my input, whether it's financial or actually going out into the field and hunting animals or interacting with people and teaching them about conservation, is it leading to enriched ecosystems? So are the fungi out there that we probably all of us love to run across on those logs, is that community of organisms more diverse now because I am a hunter and because hunters are out there contributing dollars and doing all this sort of thing? Or is it more depauperate? Are there fewer species of fungi? And I bet your listeners are going, what in the world is he talking about fungi for? We're talking about game animals here. But my question as a hunter, biologist, scientist is, okay, what about the songbirds? Are there more songbirds? Are there habitats for migratory birds, waterfowl or whatever else, to be there because I'm a hunter? Are there more insects? Are there more herps, what we call herps, anyway, lizards, snakes, etc.? Are there more and a more diverse and enriched environment because I'm a hunter? And I would argue that simply because hunters are going out there into the field, landowners are protecting, because most of this is private ownership, right? I mean, that's what we're really talking about for most. Here we have public lands in Georgia, for example, the state I live in. Texas, where I grew up in, it's really private land. Over in the UK, I noticed it's really the same thing, right? I mean, and the question is, are those landowners motivated by something to not just cut everything out, put in agricultural fields, or just a monoculture of trees, whatever the heck it would be? Or are they getting a benefit somehow? And usually that's going to be a monetary benefit. It could also be that the outfitters give them, some of the game meat. I don't, sometimes. But in a developed country, quite often, unless you have what we have, like you mentioned, the Pittman-Robertson, et cetera, where we have an excise tax off of us every time we buy something. Unless you have that, it has to be some sort of a monetary benefit to the landowner. But what I've seen in those areas is that's exactly what happens, is that monetary benefit has a real effect on landowners who then say, I'm going to protect this copse and this, all of these forested areas and keep it available so that people can go out and hunt muntjac and Chinese water deer. I'm worried they're going to bother my agricultural fields. Even if they do, I'm going to wear that because I'm bringing in enough money from the hunters and the outfitters. Does that make sense? So that's what I've seen in the UK. Now, let's go back to the muntjac for just a moment, and then I'll shut up. I promise.
No, it's
The
like you're
muntjac-
here to talk. You're here to talk, Mike. And
Well,
by
the
the way,
muntjac-
before we go, like you are like you are probably the first person on this podcast who actually saw a muntjac in its natural habitat, not as a non-native invasive species, but actually where it belongs. So I just want to acknowledge that, and folks, like this is why you should read the book.
Interesting. Once again, that's my wife's fault, because she wanted to go trek. We're backpackers. Okay. We've spent our honeymoon in the New Mexico mountains many years ago. We've been married 48 years. So many years ago, I was a long-haired hippie dude, and I backpacked constantly up in the mountains. And so Frances said, recently, I'm no longer young, recently, let's go on a trek in the Himalayas. And I looked at her and I said, I think, okay, fine. So that's why we saw the muntjac up there. I recognized what it was, but yeah. But taking the muntjac once again and thinking about it, see, as you know, it's on the EU list of damaging invasive species. It could be anything, but I mean, it's on that list. And so if those numbers are not kept down by hunting and by hunters, but sport hunters, but also culling, the muntjac suffers. 50% of them will be starved to death in a winter if there are too many of them. But it's, once again, songbirds don't have any habitats because the muntjac has eaten it all. It just decimates habitats. So should it have ever been introduced? Well, we're way past that, right? Y'all are way past that. You've got it. Now, how are you going to control it is the answer, is the question. And so hunting brings in the dollars, and it is a beautiful little animal, by the way. I mean, it's a cool little animal, but it has to be regulated through hunting, period.
Well, we spent many episodes discussing invasive species here in Ireland, Sika deer. I made an entire big episode, whether it deserves to be treated as a non-native invasive, because as you know well, there's this moment when you think like, is it naturalized? And then you look at the other species of deer, and it's like, well, like that one was brought here by Normans, and that one was not here before glaciation. And it's, once you put that perspective, like, but that's beside the point, because like we can talk about it a lot. But keeping with that in that argument, right? As well that in the UK and mainly in the UK, but even in Scotland, when I know you've just recently been in Scotland, there is a big discussion of the hunting estate where, basing on the carrying capacity of the habitat, there's like way too many red deer. And then there is obviously the whole big social conflict there, because owner of the estate, they want to have a lot of deer because they bring in clients who can shoot the deer and bring the money to them, right? And then from the ecological perspective, it's like, well, like actually the density of the deer here is like way more than it's supposed to be. There's no vegetation, there's no plant succession, and so on and so forth. So how to navigate that, difficult landscape, because and even within the non-native species, there's this argument that like hunters at some point don't want to shoot as much as they should, because like, well, we actually want to, I have like discussions regarding Sika in Ireland, right, where the main argument, like people who are against invasive species and therefore regeneration and trees and planting, say like, well, it's good that hunters want to hunt, but they shouldn't be leading that, let's say, effort, because at some point they're gonna say like, well, no, it's enough. Now we want to have some so we can hunt, while from the, for example, afforestation perspective, you should go like, well, we want to have as little as possible, ideally none. So the picture is very fluid and difficult, and I'm curious, like what would be your views on how to navigate that and turn hunting into this force for good and for habitat restoration, because we know from biology, like, habitat is king. If you have a habitat, you solve the problem, rather than you have a crappy habitat and you just basically managing species to survive. So it's a very like open question, but I'm curious of your thoughts in general on that.
Well, so I can wear a couple of hats on this one, because I've been asked to talk at conservation biology symposia all over the world about conservation biology. And you're right. I like your term fluid. And I also like the term political. You haven't used that one, but it is very political. And it's based around, and what I mean by political, I don't mean that as a pejorative term really, but rather we see it differently depending on our backgrounds, if you will. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at invasive species, we can go to the extent, or not invasive, let's just say introduced, because invasive obviously has a different connotation. It means that it is found somewhere where it's really happy and it's exploding. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But if we look at introduced species, some people will say, I love the way that you just explained that. Look, I mean, the red deer, look at glaciation, the patterns of glaciation, they weren't there during big chunks of time, right? They've only been there since 15,000 years ago, maybe 11,000 years, whatever it was, when the ice sheets pulled back. So they're an introduced species in some regards. But they got there on their own feet. They didn't have Woburn Abbey bringing them in or whatever necessarily. So those folks, but the fact of the matter is, we can look at any of these and just ask, are they contributing well to the ecosystems? Are they a positive influence on the ecosystem, or are they a negative? And almost in every case, an herbivore, regardless of what it is, and you know this once again as well as I do, an herbivore is going to be a negative if they are allowed to come up to population numbers that are devastating or destructive for the environment. They just are. I don't care if it's cattle or horses or goats or wild species. They just are. So they have to be regulated. And they can be regulated if humans weren't here, and we are. If humans weren't here, they'd get regulated through boom and bust, cycles. They would starve to death. In a bad winter, you'd lose 2/3 of them, and then they'd build back up again. So now let's go to red deer on an estate or Sika or whatever else. How do we manage that? Well, my idea as a biologist would be that we start with the plants, and we start with the microorganisms, and we start with then working up into things, once again, songbirds and lizards and everything. And we do a biological sample, both within an impacted environment and somewhere nearby. And then we're intelligent about it. We say, look, this is much richer over here where we don't have so many darn red deer or Sika or whatever that is. These are the kinds of organisms we expect to see, plants, animals, whatever. Why aren't we seeing them over here? Is it because carrying capacity has been well exceeded by a large herbivore normally is what the problem is. It's normally not, it's normally not an apex predator or something. So then we say, okay, we judge and we say, okay, we can have this many animals, and then we keep doing those surveys. We reduce the number. Yeah, and we have an economic benefit to the landowner. We don't wipe them all out, even if they're introduced. This is my idea anyway. We don't wipe out all the Sika deer, because you're bringing in income for everybody concerned, and they're a beautiful animal, and they're introduced. They're there. And so that's how I would modulate it. That's how I would intelligently work with the environment and the ecosystems. But I would have a baseline somewhere else. And it's hard to find because humans are all over. We've impacted the environment all over. There is not this is what I try to explain to the people who talk about rewilding and use that terminology of as a hammer and say we need to get people out of the way. That's impossible. It isn't going to happen, whether we hunt or not. It's just not going to happen. There is no undisturbed habitat anywhere in the world, period. It's just disturbed. So it doesn't mean that it's massively disturbed. But anyway, that's how I would do it. That's how I would work through all of those bits. But that's also coming at it as a scientist.
I totally agree. And you said this is like a political, and it is very much, because then you're driving straight into the identities of people who are on the landscape and who are doing certain things. And if people's identity is, I'm a farmer, I'm a crofter, I'm a, fill in the blank, even if by all the ecological indicators you say like, oh, this area is overgrazed, right? Then it's like, yeah, overgrazed for what? Right? Maybe it's overgrazed if you want to regenerate Caledonian rainforest. But for, Philip and Mary to have their flock and do the living, it's not overgrazed. And then you're driving into that cultural. I feel like there's a lot of that in the UK, and especially, I recently spoke with the filmmaker from the US, and we were talking about similar tensions in the United States as well, in Montana and so on. And always when you talk about those things, there's term rewilding comes in. And we talked about rewilding on this podcast also extensively. One of the things, and I would like to ask you about that, because one of the things in my naivety, or maybe putting on my naive hat, is that, a lot of people in Europe, in the UK and Ireland, certainly I'm one of those. We started into hunting. We get into hunting by watching videos of the hunting in the United States. Randy Newberg did it for me, right? This awesome public land, whatever. And then you are, and I'm sure this is the same in the United States, a lot of folks are confronted with the reality, I'm just lying in a ditch in the agricultural field, waiting for deer to come up and start grazing, and then I have a deer, right? And so putting on my naive hat would be like, all the hunters should absolutely love rewilding, because it will create this untamed, wild or semi-wild habitat where they can have those experiences. And you are the hunter who definitely, you had all those experiences in a very untouched. We know like microplastic is even in the bottom of a Mariana Trench, but compared to the hunting on the agricultural field, which you also did, that's just fantastic experience. So I would think that rewilding should be something like, hunters are all behind rewilding. Yeah, let's rewild as much as possible, which is not really what is happening. Once again, curious of your comments on rewilding itself as a movement, and how this plays with hunting and hunters, and is it good for hunting? Is it bad for hunting?
I was on a podcast recently, and I used terminology rewilding, and the podcaster bristled and said, you shouldn't use that terminology as a hunter. I said, well, I'm not just a hunter, I'm also a scientist. He said, yes, but the people who are anti-hunting use the terminology rewilding. So we sort of have to, Tommy, you and I have to define our terms here. When I say rewilding, I'm thinking of the lions. I wrote a book called Bringing Back the Lions. That was the first, like I kid about, readable book that I've written. And it was about bringing in lions and cheetahs and bringing back pangolins and all sorts of different things, elephants, into this one area. And they'd been driven to extinction by poaching and all sorts of things. So when I think of rewilding, I think of it in those terms. But it is true in the U.S. quite often, and around the world, quite often the terminology or the term rewilding is used by those who do not want hunting. What they really mean is get people out of the way, get nature back the way it was, and then just let it balance itself out. Apex predators, herbivores, whatever. So what I'm not talking about when I'm saying rewilding, of course, is that. So do I believe that we should be reintroducing, once again, rewilding, bringing in, let's talk about apex predators for a moment over here in North America. Should we be reintroducing wolves? Should we be reintroducing mountain lions, etc., into different places? They're talking about reintroducing mountain lions over here east of the Mississippi, for example, and different places, and wolves the same way. The answer I have is I would love to see them back. The reality of the situation, though, is that we can't be shy about saying that if we do this, there has to be control. And when they misbehave, quote unquote, around the humans by eating their agricultural, their livestock, their et cetera, or threatening humans by wandering into schoolyards, which the mountain lions occasionally do, we have to get rid of them. We have to be willing to hunt them to keep their numbers down to a reasonable apex predator level. But we also have to recognize that the government's going to be paying compensation to ranchers over here, etc. And as long as we're willing to do that, then okay, bring them in. But you have to understand that you can't just bring them in and say, well, anti-hunters couldn't say to us, or shouldn't, well, yeah, we're going to bring them in and you can't touch them. They just, now they're going to live free. Well, no, they can't do that.
Yeah, this is this fear, right? And the other thing, like you're dead right, Mike, that definition, especially definition of a new terms like rewilding, it is tricky, because even if someone say hunting, they can mean different things. But we instinctively understand what hunting is. And when you say rewilding, which is culturally not that established term, there is a lot of people like, oh, what do you mean? And then that opens the door to maliciously exploit even the term and put it to what it's not, right? Like, so for example, like a lot of people think that rewilding meaning reintroduction of species, which is like, good and well that this is not necessarily reintroduction of species, but giving nature space and time, crucially, to do what it's supposed to be doing. And also it's not like, oh, hands off, don't touch it, right? Because in a lot of habitats, it will just turn into the monoculture.
It will absolutely, yeah.
I totally agree with what you said. Is context specific, and I've like all the discussions in the UK and Ireland about large carnivores. I'm the same. I would love to see them, but then I wouldn't, because the social conflict that would create would be just off the chart. It would be even worse for nature.
Yeah, how do we minimize? I'm actually writing an article from the Scotland trip, which you may find amusing. It's called Hunters Reduce Human-Wildlife Conflict in Scotland. Because when I think of human-wildlife conflict, or at least, I sort of grew up with it, it was in Africa and people were getting eaten, or their livestock was getting eaten, But in Scotland, it is human-wildlife conflict around plantations, about forestry plantations. So hunting reduces red deer, sika down, so that you're not losing $1 billion industry, right? It can toggle the wrong way, where the forestry companies say, you've got to kill every one of them. If we lose one tree, that's too many. But if we're balanced, we see that the human wildlife conflict can be modulated, has to be modulated, I would argue, through hunting. If the large carnivores, and I'm like you, I mean, you know where the only place I've ever seen a wolf was in Sweden. And it was huge. It was a huge black male. He had that melanistic coloration to him. He just trotted in front and played with us. I've never seen one in North America. I was thrilled. Now, was the local farmer thrilled? The wolf
Shoot
had
the
probably just
bastard!
maybe he had just eaten his sheep, and maybe he wasn't as thrilled as I was. But as a biologist, as a person who loves nature too, I really was. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in a long, long time. But there's a human wildlife. You and I both know there's a human wildlife conflict element there. Even if it doesn't eat his sheep, the potential is there. And so he's worried. He or she is worried, right? So, you saying, hey, let's reintroduce wolves, I'd suggest you wear a vest after that so that if somebody shoots at you, they won't get you.
Throughout your book, you're making an argument and you travel along the road that hunting is good for conservation and net biodiversity gain and all this good stuff. I noticed one thing, though, that this is all describing something that I heard the term fortress conservation. Meaning, right, you have this fence and you have, or even in the UK, right, you have an estate that is owned by a duke or by, some landed gentry. And this is not accessible to people. It's exclusionary in a sense. Similar in Africa, you have these things and you have poachers and poaching, and then you have a military or paramilitary group who is protecting rhinos and poaching and so on. So you have a group of wealthy people who can afford that. And granted, they're doing, like the folks in Mozambique, I think they paying their own money. They're not making money on it for protecting pangolins and problem elephants and also that, but they have to have money first in order to be able to lose some. So there are those conservation fortresses, and that is sort of theme across the book, across these places, and hunters are sort of paying into that system. This is where we started the podcast, right? Where you have a system in place and then the hunter is a part of that system. And thanks to that, they can claim conservation. But that conservation is sort of exclusionary. And I am wondering, is that system sustainable? There's this word, right? Some people would be very upset as well. But as a biologist, sustainability is everything, like a habitat. So I am just wondering, is this sustainable? Because there is more and more pressure building up. And those people who are poaching, they're not poaching because this is something that they like. They're very poor and they take an opportunity, they try to live. So you have this sort of population who is getting poorer and more desperate outside of the fence, and a relatively wealthy population inside the, air quotes, fence that is protecting that. And that system, so the conservation and those animals and the habitats sort of rely so that system doesn't collapse, because otherwise, rhinos will be wiped out and so on. And if you look at the history and if you look how things go, the only certain things that system will eventually collapse, which is not good for conservation, which is not good for biodiversity. So I am wondering, how do you see this going into the future? What is the solution? Do you think that these solutions are robust enough that they can continue 50, 60, 100 years into the future? Or do you think that this is a good system that works right now and getting us over the hump, but ultimately we need to figure out a better way of doing it. And just by the way, to be clear, this is not anti-hunting argument, because I would like to hunting continue, but from the perspective of the habitat and conservation.
No, and it's an excellent question. So I think if we talk about first world and third world problems for a moment, it's that they overlap. I'm talking about in conservation and with hunting. They overlap to some degree. A major place that they overlap is that if you put in economic benefits for folks, and part of that in a developing country, as you and I know, is providing protein. That's, like you said, why are they poaching? Well, they're doing it for two reasons. They're feeding themselves, and it's a little bit of income in a market for them, okay? So what is the difference between, this is a question I was asking myself and continue to ask, what is the difference between a local community in Argyll in Scotland, where you have hunting going on, not on an estate, but it's still privately owned land, but I wasn't really on an estate in anywhere that I hunted around in Scotland, but it was someone's property. It wasn't high walled or high fenced or anything like that. What is the difference between that and the local community around Catata 11, this hunting concession? Once again, not fenced, but it does have anti-poaching going on. Why is there such a need for anti-poaching, etc., in Mozambique, in this area or whatever area? And I think that fortress mentality is really in both places. If you, in the sense that we have to protect it, the habitat in Scotland, just as much as we do in Mozambique. So what is the drain? Is there a faster drain? Well, I would argue, yeah, there is a faster drain in Mozambique. So what do we need? In other words, drain in the sense of people pressuring that habitat. I need that protein, blah, 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 blah. I'm not in there. I'm not being fed by Catata 11's folks from that 500,000. I'm outside of there. Well, the idea that I think is, what is the difference? Well, you guys in the UK have a middle class. Okay, you have, and I'll define this in a moment, but you have a middle class. We have a middle class here. Well, what that means is you have the most of your people fit as they do in the US. Most of your people economically are in a category where we have some expendable income. And in Mozambique, they may be in Catata 11. They're spending that disposable income on things like rechargers for their cell phones or whatever it happens to be. Okay, here Francis and I, my wife and I, bought some lawn chairs because we have some disposable income. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, what it means is if we have disposable income, we're not going around and exploiting the environment per se and putting that additional pressure on that environment because we don't have to survive. We don't have to try to get every animal off of there that we can to get them into snares and all, because our children are not going hungry. Okay, not only that, but they're actually going to school and they have medical care and etc. So where I see this going is if we could, my vision is to franchise these sorts of operations, and in Catata 11 it's not alone, but to franchise these where people are there and developing community outreach and developing conservation tools for the community to understand why it is necessary not to devastate the environment, and why it's important that all of this goes on, and why it's important to have wealthy folks coming in, so that it breaks down that fortress, but it has to be broken down because the people don't need to attack it. And the only way you can do that is to build that, to expand that community out where they actually have enough food, they have enough money, They are taking care of their business, but they also can have some extravagances. I don't know how else it can work. That's why it works here in the U.S. That's why it works. I know that we have problems. We have lots of problems in conservation all over in the first world. But it's a lot less pressure, I would argue, in a lot of ways than it is in Mozambique or Cameroon, where it's just a desert if you let it go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And do you think that it's the ultimately what I'm here? Well, I don't want to put the words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing is really to address inequality in a sense.
Absolutely. I think, okay, I'm a Christian, and so I'm going to show that for a moment. I'm also a geek, so both of those go hand in hand, apparently. But I think we're supposed to be good stewards, and we're supposed to be good stewards towards people, and we're supposed to be good stewards towards the environment. And if we're not taking care of both of those things, then we're a lousy human being. And so I would just, and I can be a lousy human being. Just ask my kids. But the fact of the matter is, I think if we take care of both of those things, that we have a concern for the people in these places and the environment in these places, I think that's how you spread this. Because the people will catch on that the people initiating this, then they're going to catch it, that bug, and then they're going to teach their kids, the local folks.
No, it is interesting, and the subject of improving conservation and nature in general by reducing the inequality is very interesting one, and you agree with me. And obviously there is an argument that once you bring wealthy people, then you're not doing that, but that's a separate argument, and economy is another science that is anything but settled and very difficult. It's a subject for another podcast, I guess. I just want to, from this, go a little bit to the future. How do you see the future of hunting and the future of conservation? If we are staying in this frame of conservation is supported by hunting, hunting is very important for conservation across the world, like your book proves. And I'm not so much worried about people who, want to end hunting, animal rights activists or animal rights extremists, like some call it. And you're in a final chapter of your book, you're a little bit defiant on that, like, bring it on, right? But I'm thinking, like, if you go to these hunting organization meetings, it's hard to find someone, below 40. Hell, it is hard to find someone below 50. So this is like one of the questions that I always ask people who are in the space of hunting. How do you see hunting into the future? Because I don't worry about the extremists. I don't worry about animal rights. I don't worry about vegans and so on. I'm worrying about TikTok and PlayStation. I'm worrying about that all the hunters will age out and die, and then what then going to happen to those fortress conservations, because nobody will be putting money in. So I'm teeing that off this way, and from that perspective, I'm curious your views, like how hunting and in what form hunting will continue into the future, again 30, 50, 100 years from now.
So if we don't, this is what you're saying, if we do not continue to bring young hunters in, and Frances and I, my wife and I, owned a shotgun shooting facility, and one of the most fun things was teaching kids, showing them about shooting and introducing them to that sport. The same way with hunting. We are a very urbanized society in the United States, much more so even than when I was growing up. And so there isn't that understanding and appreciation for nature, if nothing else. And like you said, getting away from the place that, getting away from our computers, getting away from our phones. What are we doing? And so what I'm seeing at these meetings, like I gave a talk at the Safari Club International Michigan chapter, which is huge. And they have such a large emphasis on incorporating kids into their community. And these are kids maybe from non-hunting, not anti-hunting, but non-hunting families, but just kids who have an interest in it. And I'm seeing a groundswell within the U.S. I do not know in the U.K. I'm ignorant of that, but I see a groundswell in the U.S. and in North America of many organizations taking on the challenge of incorporating young people into the groups. Because you're exactly right. My kids, who are both 40 now, so they're millennials, my kids tell me I'm in the damn near dead category. We need to get lots of folks who are younger in, and that's what I'm seeing. And, kidding about the bring it on kind of thing, it is true. We can do that, but that's not, me tongue in cheek saying that. That's not, I agree with you. That's not the problem. Anti-hunters, and I have friends who are anti-hunting, and I've said that to hunters, and they said that's impossible. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. I got friends who are anti-hunters who are members of PETA, and they read my books. And I told them there are dead animals in there. You may not want to read this book, but they're not the problem. It will be because demographically we'll die out. We've got to get the demographics. We've got to get that pyramid flipped back over again and get that base broader demographically in terms of age. And so I can't agree with you more. I cannot agree with you more.
Well, you folks, you heard that firsthand many times in this podcast, and now again, if you want to make sure that the nature and the biodiversity and conservation will be good, you need to get your kids into hunting, because that is not because they will be killing stuff, but because they will understand the habitat. They will value the habitat, the fungi, the insects, and the vertebrates, the songbirds, the whole deal. And if out of all that they get that roe deer or muntjac or whatever, so be it. Mike, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, folks. The links as usual in the description of the show. Bringing back the wild, stories from revitalized ecosystems around the world and how sports hunting supports them. The link is in the description, so you can click in there, get the book. Mike, thank you so much.
Tommy, thank you so much. Wonderful time.
Before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.